have a look at one chapter, or part of one chapter. It's not going to be a deep theological look at a whole variety of things. We're just going to have a look at one chapter of the Bible, and it's a chapter 5 from Mark. Now, the book of Mark, if you're like me, you think of the book of Mark a little bit like Ringo from the Beatles. It's one of the Fab Four, it's one of the Gospels, but Mark's a bit like Ringo in that it's not quite as important as Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, Paul, and George. It's sort of the one that's, it's not as long and as historically detailed as Luke. And there's not that real thing that sends it apart like John, where Jesus again and again in the book of John, Jesus keeps declaring, I'm God, I'm the Son of God. It's sort of Mark is the one that doesn't quite have the same sort of theological depth as Matthew. And it's just there, but it's kind of important, and we know it's important. And like Ringo, it was the oldest, and it was the first written, but it's kind of like the shorter, and you're sort of going, yeah, okay, Mark's there. But you can't really find anything in Mark that you can't find somewhere else. But we'll have a look today at a chapter of Mark, and hopefully, just like when you really look and listen, you appreciate Ringo more. Hopefully, that when we've had a bit of a look at this, we might appreciate Mark a bit more as well. Now, we're looking at Mark chapter 5, and it's an extraordinarily, when you start looking at it, it's an incredibly rich and varied chunk of scripture. And in this one chapter, it contains 3 of the most well-known incidents or situations in Christ's time here on earth. Firstly, in the first chunk of the chapter, as Brent sort of quite mildly said to me when we said, well, what do you need visually? Just Mark chapter 5. He said, well, there's 43 verses in it, so how much do you want? And it is a long chapter. And the first roughly half of it is taken up, and if you've been in church for a while, you know the situation where Jesus goes across the Sea of Galilee and sees the guy who's demon-possessed legion, and then he sends the demons out of him into the pigs, and the pigs all run into the sea. It's one of the ones that, if you've ever had an illustrated Bible or anything like that, I can still remember an illustration in a sort of a kid's Bible way back in the more years ago than I care to sort of reveal, but it's one of those ones. And then the next half of the chapter is taken up with this incredibly human interaction with Jesus and a few other people. And what it does, what this chapter does, and this situation in particular reveals, I think, both the complexity of Jesus, how when you ever try to put Jesus in a box, that there is a complexity there that just says no. And also, though, it reveals with such clarity so many things. So it's this kind of contradiction of complexity and clarity. Now, because it's good, I'm going to read this chunk to you. And it says, Jesus raises, the little heading in my Bible, it says that Jesus raises a dead girl and heals a sick woman. Cool stuff. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, so he's just basically done the get out of the demons, and the guy wants to follow it. He says, no, go and show what I've done. A large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. And you're going to start to imagine that people have started to hear stuff. And they're starting to go, hang on, let's go and see this. What else have you got on today? Not much? Okay, well, let's go. We're sure not going to be eating bacon anyway, that's for sure. Now, then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, my little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And we can imagine this, you can almost feel when you start to just go, oh, hang on. You can see there's this pack of people and there's a bit of anticipation. Here's obviously a well-known, important guy, and he has just come and thrown himself at Jesus' feet. And you can imagine, right, the crowds go, right, we want to see what's going on now. Let's watch with it. This should be good. We've heard about the pigs, we heard about the pigs, we heard about it. Okay, let's go and watch now. What's going to happen? And they pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Now, how does Mark know that? How does that know what she was thinking? We're going to find out. Immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realised that the power had gone out from him. He turned around into the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, this is one where really, wouldn't you love to see the expressions on the disciples about this time? Because you can imagine, here they are, they're going, they've just seen him declare these demons into the pigs, and they've seen so much, and they're going, this guy is good. Wow, this guy, he is the deal. And then, in the middle of a crowd, a huge jostling crowd, he then asks, "Who touched me?" And you can just, what the heck? And you could imagine that probably Peter is sitting there biting his tongue going, well, any one of about 40 of them. And that you can imagine Jesus' stocks just going down because they're thinking, well, he's just gone from hero to, Captain Obvious. Who do you think? Who touched me? But Jesus, looking around to see who had done it, kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. That's how Mark knows what she was thinking, because he made her tell everybody. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Interesting, he says, don't be afraid rather than don't be sad. Don't be afraid, just believe. He didn't let anyone follow him except Peter, James and John, the brother of James. There's a whole lot of disappointed people right there. They were on their way somewhere and they're, no, you're not going. Well, what? Come on. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and waving loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." And by now, those disciples must be starting to go, "Oh, mate, you didn't know what to touch him now, and now this, oh, good grief." They laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, say to you, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. Jesus stocks her back up there now. He gave strict orders not to let anyone else know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. Now, it's an incredible story, and it's one of those stories where the more you go through it and you start to look, the more there are those moments where you're going, what the heck? How about that? I never thought, It's got so many of those little light bulb moments in. We're going to have a look at for just a few minutes. Now, we notice the first thing when Jesus, he's there in the crowd, and then up comes Jairus. And he's named. And we know everyone knew who he was. It was Jairus, the synagogue leader. And he comes in there, and immediately, though, what does Jairus do? He throws himself at Jesus' feet and says, "Please come. Please come. My little daughter is dying." Now, it's interesting that in all the books of the Gospels, Mark is the one with the least propensity to give us detail. And yet he gives us that one, and it's like he's saying, "My little girl is dying." Now, for a father, there probably is no more profoundly anguishing sentence to say ever than my little girl is dying. And you can just, barely imagine what Jairus, he is utterly broken and just thrown. Please come. You're my last hope. My little, not my daughter, my little girl is dying. And in Luke adds another detail. She was his only child. So you can imagine, just begin to imagine what Jairus is experiencing here. Now, note this though. Jairus in the Gospels isn't the only guy who comes up to Jesus and says, my kid's dying. There's another one. The Roman centurion who comes and says, my child's dying. But then the Roman centurion says, don't bother coming, just say. Just say. And Jesus goes, wait, you've got faith. Now notice what Jesus doesn't do here. Does Jesus say to Jairus, sorry Jairus, but there's a Roman centurion around who's got more faith than you, so sucks to be you. No. Jesus responds to the faith that he has. Jesus responds and meets him. Jairus comes to Jesus and Jesus said, you've come to me, that's what you've shown your faith in coming to me. Jesus is not sitting there saying, well, if only you've got a bit more faith. He's saying, righto. And Jesus doesn't quibble. He goes with Jairus immediately. Now, while this is happening, and you can imagine just that there's this flicker of hope in Jairus. You could just imagine that, well, here's his last hope, and now there's at least, hope was gone, pretty well gone, and now there's a flicker. Now you would think, if you're Jairus, we have got, if we're looking at sort of modern ways of viewing it, we've got a problem here that's both important and urgent. My kid's dying. This is important and urgent, and now Jesus is on his way. Then, the woman with blood comes into it, with the issue of blood. Excuse me. And the only time in all the Gospels where we see an incident like this, where someone actually draws, they drew the power out of me. Jesus stops. And our story just changes like that. It's like, whoa, where are we? What's going on now? Now, you probably know that for this woman to even be in that crowd was an incredible risk, because under Jewish law she was unclean and had been consistently unclean, therefore pretty much an outcast for 12 years. And so she also is desperately hoping. But I think we could probably agree that while her problem is important and a desperate one, it doesn't quite have the same urgency. Not quite. Now, I had a bit of a look into this, and Mark sort of relates that this woman, she was poverty-stricken. Why? Because she'd spent everything she had on cures. Now, I had a bit of a look to see what kind of cures she may have tried to buy. The only ones I could find, because frankly, they don't really know, but some of the commentators I looked at guessed at things like they would mix stuff that was like ancient sort of baking soda with wine and onions in wine and sort of drink that. One of the ones that I found that I did like, but it's very cruel. Well, you'll see what I mean in a minute. And it reminds you of getting rid of hiccups. Was that she would stand the sufferer might stand at a crossroads with wine with a whole lot of stuff in it, drinking the wine, and then have someone come up behind her and try to scare her, yelling, "You are clean!" And that was supposed to frighten the condition out of her. So you can imagine that this woman has had hope and seen it dashed on, yet she has spent all she had. Now, the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things here, is that what's supposed to happen under Jewish law is that if she touches Jesus, he becomes unclean. But she touches Jesus, and instead of him becoming unclean, she becomes clean. And she knows it immediately. It says that she knew it immediately. As soon as it happened, she felt it. And so did he. And the interesting thing is, again, this Jesus in a box. So often we're told, oh, no, don't pray like this or pray like that, because this is how the 5 keys to faith, or 5 ways that we pray and it'll work. And yet we don't see that in the Gospels. We see things that are so different.
That's good.
We see things that Jesus doesn't, with both of these people, they're very, very different. Jesus ends up meeting both their needs, but neither of them follow the formula. And the only time that Jesus ever, that we know of, that Jesus ever says someone's actually drawn the power out of me is this time. She touched his cloak. Now, she's not simply touching his cloak, because there were people, as the disciples said, well, who touched you? But one reached out. A lot of people touched him, but only one reached out. Only one reached out, and that was her. She reached out to Jesus. That was the difference. And as the theologian of number of centuries ago, St. Augustine says, flesh presses, faith touches. It's a great little couplet, that. Now, Jesus then, basically, almost cruelly, we think, stops and draws attention to her. Now, she must have been terrified, and she was, it shows it, because here she's been exposed in this terrible. Yeah, Jesus, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Why are you almost humiliating this woman? Why might it have been? For a couple of reasons, I think. Firstly, she's never going to go away and think, mate, I did something good by that. He made it very clear that it was the power coming out of him. He made it very clear to her that it wasn't that she's not going to go home and build a shrine to a garment. She's not going to do any of that. She is going to go home and say, it was the power of Jesus.
Amen. Yeah, that's it.
And she's declared that power of Jesus. Yeah. She's done that very clearly. The other thing that I think is quite likely is that he is basically showing Jairus, you've got hope. Because one of the things that you can almost, when you start to see it in your mind's eye, can you imagine Jairus at this time? Jairus, the proud, well-known man, has come in and in such a broken way thrown himself at Jesus' feet and said, come, please come. And Jesus has. And there's that flicker of hope, and we're moving. And Jairus, you could almost imagine he's got hold of Jesus' wrist coming. My little girl is dying. Now, I'm sure this lady's problem is a significant one, and it was. But this is urgent. And it's sort of, and now we're having a discussion about clothes. And you could almost see Jairus, come on. What is going on here? Yeah, it's a serious, but does it get, come on. And yet Jairus has just got to basically stand and wait. And you can imagine what he's going through. And you can imagine him going, why are can't we come back and have this discussion later? She's been here for 12 years. Another hour won't hurt. And come on, but Jesus is not going to be rushed. And you could imagine Jairus going, where are the priorities here? Yeah, it's important, but Jesus is not going to be rushed. Now, the other thing here that then happens in verse 37 is that Jesus tells the crowd to go. And I must admit, I'm not 100% sure why. But it does bring an interesting contrast in just a minute. But then Jesus, when the message comes to Jairus, says, your daughter is dead, don't trouble the teacher anymore, it's too late. Then Jesus just says, no, don't be afraid, just believe. And it's almost like he was saying, yeah, look at what you've just seen. Just believe. And he's gone with Jairus. Now, Jairus being an important person, even the poorest people would have at least some sort of musician or someone to mourn the death of someone. And so Jairus being important probably is wealthy, and probably then, someone in his household has had the mourners ready to go. And Jesus comes in and says, oh, quiet down. And then tells them all to go away, except for the disciples and Jairus, and then goes in. And here's where we have one of these beautiful, incredibly human moments. Because believe it or not, there's only, aside from a couple of names of things, there's only 3 times in the Gospels where Jesus is recorded as speaking in Aramaic. One of them's on the cross where he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, oh my God, why have you forsaken me? Another is a couple of chapters further down the road in Mark, where he declares to a deaf man's ears be open. And the third one is here. And Jesus goes in and says and it's recorded in Aramaic, Talitha kum, which basically, to try to capture what it would mean, it means he's saying something along the lines of, honey, get up. Just this beautiful little endearment. Not arise thy daughter or anything like that. It's like he goes in and he says he took her by the hand. And you can just imagine just that scene and what Jairus must have experienced. He goes, just to go by the hand. Honey, get up. With no more fuss than that. And she did. And you think, wow, for Jairus, all hope was gone. And yet in the most beautiful human way you could imagine, with just that affection, honey, get up. And we see how important those little things, my little girl, honey, those little touches that just show us so much of the character of Jesus and the character of God in that. And it's interesting that it's mentioned there, if not there in Luke, and I think it's mentioned here, but that she was 12 years old. And isn't it an interesting thing? That how long had the woman with the issue of blood been suffering? 12 years. And it's kind of like, here is a woman who'd been in darkness for 12 years and she saw light. Here is a man who, for 12 years in some ways, had sunlight. And my experience of daughters is about, 12 years is about the amount of sunlight you get, and then sort of starts to get into a bit of evening after that. He had 12 years of sunlight, which was going to be extinguished.
That's so good.
And in both cases, there was hopelessness, exclusion and suffering. Yet very, very differently, but very humanly. But both of them, in both cases, at one point, both Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood, both would have thought, what are you doing? You're almost being cruel. Who touched me? Who touched me? Oh no, you can imagine, no, don't. And at that same moment, you can imagine there's Jairus going, oh, don't, come on. And yet in both cases. But where does it end up? And I think one of the things that I think for people who are going through challenges or whatever, if you're at that moment, and it might feel like a very long moment, where you're there going, oh, hurry up. Just believe. Don't be afraid. And the contrast that we see here, and again, one of the things that I've often just thought, when you hear people going on about, this is how you pray, this is what you must do, I sometimes get sceptical about this, because look at some of these contrasts between this one incident. Here's Jairus. He's a wealthy, well-known man. This woman who's poverty-stricken, she had spent it all. She's got no money, and we don't even know her name. There are a number of possibilities, and early church history suggested possibilities, but we don't know. So look at this contrast here immediately. You couldn't make one of these miracles more public. Almost like she was in front of the whole crowd. The big crowd's gathered right over, boom. And the other one, he sends everyone away. One, please, Jesus, come with me. Please, please. The other, she's reaching out to him. One, you have to wait, Jairus. The other was like that. Immediately she felt it. And the one you wouldn't expect, secret, and the one that you wouldn't expect, public. And so, when we look at this, we see so much of that again, that the humanity, when Jesus is 100% human, 100% God, we see that humanity here. We see how, no, it's different. This is what you need. This is what you need. And that the comfort that we can get from that, in that this is what we need. Now, I will just invite for communion the Reverend Dr. Raymond up for communion, and while he's coming up, just to summarise, what are the things that they both brought? And in one, we could probably summarise, if we are going to go against my little theory, they both brought faith. In their own way, they both brought faith. They both brought humility. You notice that Jairus at the feet of Jesus, and so is this lady at the hem of his garment. And in both cases, they got healing. And so I think that, yes, the other thing, final thing with that, is that at the time, Jairus would wonder, why are we waiting? Why? And probably more than once that woman sort of said, why couldn't this have happened years ago? But at the end, do you think either of them were disappointed? I don't think so. And I think for us today, that perhaps that's one of the big takeaways. And if you're in the position where you're going, oh God, why? Then maybe just go, again, don't be afraid, just believe. And that somewhere in there, Jesus is working it through, so that maybe you're seeing something that you need to see. Maybe someone else he's dealing with that, where he can get to you. Who knows? That's worth considering. So that's all I've got to say about that. I'll hand over to the Reverend Doctor now.